Hello, everybody. Of course, to begin with, we should mention that the possibility of a strike is real. And if there is a strike, I'll be on the picket line and there will be no classes. Recall I said that you need, in that case, to work on your essay, which counts for a lot. And I also said that I can only, I am basing the exam on the review questions, and I will be covering only the review questions that I cover in this series of programs. So that's the setup. Are there any questions? Okay. Um, so hope to see you on Wednesday, but maybe not. I can't say. Um, so to pick up the narrative today, what we're going to see is the beginning of a new American policy. That's the basic theme of the lecture. Johnson is replaced by Nixon, and Nixon and his Secretary of State, Kissinger, elaborate a new policy, which is fundamentally about withdrawing American ground troops from the war and placing the responsibility of the war more and more in the hands of the ARVN of the South Vietnamese Army, and trying to build up this army so that it can fight the PAVN, the People's Army from the north, and the National Liberation Front. At the same time, the Americans continue and intensify the air war. That's one leg of this new policy. The other leg has to do with international affairs. They basically attempt, instead of the policy that had been followed from Kennedy through Johnson of not merely resisting the North Vietnamese, but basically trying to contain China, the policy shifts to basically trying to play China against the Soviet Union. The split is open and bitter between these two powers. And Kissinger sees this as an opening, and he begins to manipulate the situation diplomatically so as to get the best deal for the United States possible, and to ensure that if they can't win in South Vietnam, at least the Americans will be able to stay in East Asia. That's the arc of this policy. It has the two elements, Vietnamization, but also sort of taking advantage of the Soviets-Chinese split, and using that to ensure America isn't completely humiliated by perhaps a North Vietnamese victory in Vietnam. Are there any questions about this overall view? Because that's what the particulars of the narrative are heading toward. Okay, so we saw last time that the internal situation in the United States was extremely grave following the Tet Offensive. This had been developing for several years, but there was just the students were literally up in arms, and they were increasingly joined by large segments of the population, the so-called doves. At the same time, the civil rights movement had turned into the Black Power movement. And when Martin Luther King was assassinated in early April 1968, all hell broke loose. This was the climax of the Black Revolt. 130 cities went up in flames, thousands and thousands of casualties. Washington, D.C., under military rule. And student unrest was at its very height. Um, there was particularly the students singled out any presence of the military on campus, of the Reserve Officers Training Program. Their buildings were attacked. Any military recruiters who came on campus, and also the students did research and found that, in fact, many of their universities were engaged in research funded by the Pentagon, and the university administrators came under attack, not only for what they were doing to the students, but also this basically war-directed military research. The most notorious event in all of this ferment was what happened at Columbia University in April of '68. Several hundred students joined by Black activists from Harlem, Columbia being right next to Harlem, basically seized several university buildings, protesting military research, but also the fact that the university had annexed real estate adjacent to the university, and they had displaced Black tenants in these buildings and were going to build a gym for the students. And this sort of raised the whole question of the situation of Black people. Columbia was, to go to Columbia, you had to be part of the privileged class. And so it brought to a head the class inequality, the racial inequality in the United States, and so on. So, so this is what the students did in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination, and the university basically called in the New York Police Department. Now, if you know anything about the New York Police Department, this is it's been true since the 19th century. The New York Police Department is, New York being what it is, they have, it's basically an army, and today it is an army. And they have their own intelligence unit and so on. Of course, there's a lot of radical people in New York, and so that they called in the New York Police Department, and they came in force, and there were pitched battles between the police department and the students who were occupying these buildings, and it was given maximum publicity because New York, being the media center in the United States, a lot of this was broadcast, and so it was very dramatic. And then following that, most of the students at Columbia went on strike, and the university had to cancel the academic year. But this situation was, variants of it were happening in many places in the universities at this time. And I might mention the situation at San Francisco State, which was it wasn't yet a university. Today it is a university. It was called San Francisco State College. And it had a very large student body, whites, Blacks, and also Asians. And it was the Blacks and the Asians making common cause, who basically seized control of that university. As I say, it was a big university. And the whole university was paralyzed for weeks and months by the students. And even more alarming from the point of view of the authorities was that these Black and Asian students made contact with the Black and Asian working class in San Francisco. The agitation was spreading from the students to the working class, something that was relatively rare elsewhere in the United States. That is, of course, just what the student radicals wanted. Well, that was ultimately suppressed too. By the way, the president of that university, Hayakawa, a linguist, was a graduate of the University of Manitoba. So we have some distinguished alumni. A joke. In any case, meanwhile the election was going on in the United States, and in particular important was, as we saw, the Democratic primary, which had forced Johnson out of office. He couldn't face it, and what we see is that there was McCarthy from Minnesota. There was Kennedy from New York. Kennedy was a senator from New York, and there was Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president. He came from Minnesota, been a senator, but he became Johnson's vice president, and Johnson represented, or Humphrey represented Johnson continuity with Johnson's policies. This is the way he was identified. He attempted to sort of distance himself, but it was clear that he was close to Johnson. On the other hand, McCarthy and Kennedy were, they said openly that they were against the war. What that meant, being against the war, was not clear. What I mean is, maybe McCarthy was for withdrawal, but it's not clear that Robert Kennedy was for American withdrawal from the war. He just said he was against the war, he was for peace. So it was rather ambiguous. But of these three candidates, Kennedy was the best placed. He had the mystique of his brother, John Kennedy, Kennedy family, and so on, who were regarded by some people with almost religious reverence. And he drew the support of a lot of the Black population, the Latino population, the poor ethnic working class. There were, aside from Hispanics and Blacks, there were, of course, people from Eastern Europe and so on. They tended to identify with the Kennedys. Note that all of these the Hispanics and some of the white working class were Catholic, and the Kennedys were important because John Kennedy had been the first Catholic to be elected president of the United States. So that's part of the background. McCarthy, on the other hand, appealed to students, academics, middle class, liberals. Those kinds of people tended to identify similar types to those who identify with Bernie Sanders, if you recall the Bernie Sanders campaign. Well, there was a series of primaries, and at the end of the day, the last and most important of these primaries occurred in California, and Kennedy won a very convincing victory in California. This was on the 5th of June. Displacing, it was clear that Kennedy was headed for nomination as president. But that very night, there was a victory celebration, and at this celebration, people were milling around. There was a large crowd, and an assassin darted forward, and he shot down Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy died. The assassin was a Palestinian, as a matter of fact, by the name of Saran. And Um, this was what one has to remember, that in the Middle East, this so-called 6 Days War between Israel and the Arab states had just taken place, and Israel had triumphed, and uh, Iran was acting in the name of the Palestinian resistance because the Americans had supported the Israelis. And at this time, I would say that in terms of American public opinion, and indeed beyond the United States, the Israelis, many people supported the Israelis against the Arabs. Who were the Arabs and so on? Who are these Palestinians? And that gives you an idea, because today the situation is different. Certainly, some people continue to support the Israelis, but opinion in the United States and Canada, in the advanced capitalist countries, there's been a big shift, and majorities are supporting the Palestinians. In other words, the Palestinian side is much better understood today than it was back then. Well, the death of Kennedy, McCarthy had lost, meant that Hubert Humphrey was going to be the Democratic candidate. And since it was known that the Republican candidate was going to be Richard Nixon, he was a hawk. It meant that the peace camp had been shut out. And so the Humphrey was going to be officially nominated in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, which was scheduled for the summer of 1968. And it was there that the political violence that I've been talking about so far reached its climax, because anti-war radicals, notably the so-called yippies, who were one of the Youth International Party. They called themselves the Youth International Party. This was maybe of several hundred people who combined sort of anti-war activity and so on with the kind of all kinds of pranks and sort of colorful demonstrations. They didn't amount to much, but they got a lot of publicity because there were some characters involved with them, a guy by the name of Jerry Rubin and some others who were sort of colorful media figures. It was them and another group called the National Mobilization to End the War, which basically called for demonstrations. Well, ultimately, about 12,000 anti-war activists went to Chicago under these rubrics, and they announced that they were going to physically stop the nomination of Humphrey. In response, the mayor of Chicago, who was a friend of Lyndon Johnson and of Humphrey, a machine politician by the name of Richard Daley. The Daleys had controlled Chicago politics for decades. This guy was a tough guy. He said, "Well, we're going to take care of these characters." So Daley assembled a force of police and National Guardsmen, totaling about 20,000, against these 12,000 demonstrators. And while Humphrey is being nominated in the convention hall, a huge riot breaks out in a nearby park between the police and the demonstrators. All of this is on national TV. There's huge fogs of tear gas and so on. And the police are clubbing people down, and the crowd is throwing stuff and shouting, "Kill, kill, kill," just like in Vietnam. and the whole world is watching, and it was quite an event. And in fact, you can watch it again on Netflix, because there is currently on Netflix a film called The Chicago Seven, on Netflix. And it recapitulates these events and the subsequent trial of the leading anti-war activists at this event. And it explains a lot of what was going on in 1968, this film. So it's worth watching. I would recommend it. Well, so this is what the scene was. And one of the journalists who wrote about these events, a radical journalist, famous radical journalist by the name of I.F. Stone, he commented, because this is remembered, quote unquote, "The war is destroying our country as we are destroying Vietnam." In other words, yes, Vietnam is being destroyed, but the United States is in the process of decomposition in these circumstances. So that was what was happening in the Democratic Party, and it didn't look as an aftermath. The Democrats were blamed by public opinion. They were low in public opinion as a result. This was a scandal. The Democrats stood for chaos in the eyes of many of the potential voters. That was the view. So this sort of opened the way for the alternative party, the Republicans, and their candidate was, of course, Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, and I'll have more to say about him, he was, the Republican convention was yet to happen, but everybody knew that he would be the candidate. And he kept going around saying, what we need is law and order. We need a restoration of law and order, which was, of course, a knock at the Democrats. Law and order. And of course, it was who was disturbing the peace? It was these damn students and the blacks. So this was also a kind of racial thing, at this concept of restoring law and order. That was one aspect of his stand. The other one was, Nixon said, I stand for peace, but not at any price. But not at any price. Of course, everybody was saying we're for peace. And they always say that we're for peace. All politicians say they're always for peace, but there's war. And, you know, it's sort of manipulative rhetoric and so on. But so that was Nixon's stand. Law and order and peace, but not at any price. But there was also a third candidate who in the end attracted a significant amount of votes, and this was George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. George Wallace. Now, Wallace had already emerged in 1964, and Wallace had made a career when the civil rights movement developed. He was the governor of Alabama, and he stood in the doorway. He used his powers as governor to try and block racial desegregation in the South, in his state. Other governors in the South were doing the same thing, but Wallace attracted a lot of publicity. And then he ran for president already in '64. And now again in 1968. Now, his views were to the right of Nixon, because whereas Nixon spoke about peace without any price, but not at any price, Wallace openly called for the invasion of North Vietnam and for using nuclear weapons against North Vietnam. At the same time, he spoke about negotiations. He spoke out of both sides of his mouth. Oh yes, let's have negotiations. But clearly there was this populist sort of rhetoric. The solution is to absolutely destroy the other side. And a lot of Wallace is significant because he, of course, in the South, he actually won the South in this election. George Wallace won the states of the South in this election because the South, of course, was you know, a lot of these Southerners think of themselves, they all have guns and so on, they go hunting, and they were overrepresented in the military, and they were against the blacks and these whites. And so they went to Wallace, who was a segregationist. But what's significant, too, is the fact that in northern working class communities, especially in the Middle West, people voted for Wallace. They were voting for Wallace. There was a reaction going on against the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in the white community, especially amongst working people, white working class, were reacting. And you can see this is this kind of politics. Well, it has been present in Canada in various forms before, but we see today that first of all, the emergence of the People's Party, this populist party. There are echoes, and now still they got what, 7% of the vote, but these are early days, possibly. And also, I would say that although the press doesn't give it much attention, I think there is a reaction against the progress of the indigenous in Canada and growing resentment amongst especially lower income people against the indigenous population. And we haven't seen the end of this. I'm just drawing your attention to this. So this politics that we see in the United States, well, it's echoed in Canada to a certain degree. So what we find is that the Democratic Party was fractured. The Democrats completely lost the South and still haven't recovered. The South is basically Republican to this day. The overall the internal conflicts within the United States were intensifying. Well, as I said, all of these candidates called for negotiations, but none of them were prepared to concede the possibility of a communist state in South Vietnam. They all wanted to maintain the Republic of Vietnam. In any case, the outcome of the election was that Nixon won, but it was surprising that Humphrey, in the end, was able to. He wasn't that far behind Nixon. In any case, it was Nixon who won the election. Now, Nixon had always been very much on the right of American politics. As a matter of fact, he started out. Of course, I had mentioned Senator Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism, this kind of hysterical anti-communism of the late 40s. Well, Nixon actually began his career in the shadow of McCarthy, and McCarthy's politics were Nixon's politics, and Nixon's politics were McCarthy's. There were communist subversives everywhere. And he was successful using this ploy, Richard Nixon. And So much so that Eisenhower made him the vice president. Eisenhower was very popular. He put Nixon on the ticket, and Nixon became the vice president um, in the election of 1954. And in 1955, the issue of Indochina, of course, was real. The Viet Minh had triumphed over the French. What would happen? And Nixon, interviewed in '55 about the situation in Indochina, said, "Well, we may have to resort to nuclear weapons to block Chinese expansionism." At least he understood that it's all about the Chinese. Now, he pulled back from that position. Generally, when Johnson escalated the war in '65, Nixon said, yes, that's the right thing to do. Johnson is aggressive, and that's what we need more and more. We have to be firm with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Well, he changed during the election with respect to Johnson. He said that the problem with Johnson was that he had adopted the policy of gradual escalation. That was wrong, said Nixon. We should have gone there in whole hog, and indeed we should have invaded North Vietnam. He was a hawk, and he said these things during the election campaign because it was attractive, because people wanted, the people on the right, the hawks wanted to hear this. These were his voters, so he gave them what they wanted. Invade Vietnam, etc., invade North Vietnam. But that was one thing he said. But the second thing that Nixon said was, oh, Hanoi, they won't compromise. They won't deal with us. They won't move back across the 17th parallel. So we shouldn't even deal with Hanoi, because Hanoi is really a puppet of Moscow. The real power lies in Moscow. Hanoi is just an extension of Moscow, dependent on Moscow. And so we should negotiate not with these characters from Hanoi, but we have to go and open up negotiations directly with the Russians. And if we can reach a deal about Vietnam, but also about a lot of other aspects of the Cold War, if we can reach a comprehensive agreement with the Russians, the Hanoi government and the National Liberation Front will listen to orders from Moscow. I mean, he's representing the situation as if Joe Stalin was still around, and Joe Stalin is controlling all the communists all over the world. Well, that situation disintegrated already in the as soon as Stalin died after 1953. No, there was what we call communism had become polycentric, and especially there was places like Yugoslavia or even Romania, but who went their own way. But especially the Chinese. The Chinese and by the mid-50s and the Soviets were openly arguing with one another. And the Russians, and of course, certainly Hanoi was allied with Moscow, but they were also allied with the Chinese. And in fact, there was a rivalry between these two states. So to say that you're going to go to Moscow and settle the war is ridiculous. The Chinese are still in there and supporting the Vietnamese. They're closer. And also the Russians, in rivalry to the Chinese, are they going to turn around and betray Hanoi and say, yes, we'll make a deal with Washington? To hell with Hanoi? Of course not. In fact, this was a big issue in the communist world, support for the Vietnamese against American imperialism. There was no way that the Russians. And besides, why should the Russians fall in? The Americans um, were were drowning in Vietnam. So why should the Russians help the Americans, and so on? That was the true situation. But Nixon, he pretended this was the case, and he went even a step further. Foolish. He said, "I have a secret plan to settle the war. I can't disclose it until you elect me president of the United States. Afterwards, I'll disclose my secret." There was no secret. It's just a lie on his part. That's Nixon, and we'll have a little bit more to say about Nixon. Now, that was what Nixon said, but meanwhile, he was in contact with a professor from Harvard by the name of Henry Kissinger, who was an expert on international relations, conservative, was certainly in his Kissinger was a real conservative, but he was a rational conservative. He understood politics, especially international relations. And he was close to the Rockefeller family, the Rockefeller family. And I think the Rockefellers, listen, they had enormous wealth and prestige and power, and they had a big say. Obviously, there are lots of rich people in the United States, and they're the people overall who call the shots. But the Rockefellers, for many decades, had a big influence. And Kissinger basically was close to them. He was sort of a house intellectual of the Rockefeller family. Now, Kissinger believed, his view was that Johnson had made a disastrous mistake by escalating the war in 1965. This was a terrible mistake. And as a result, the United States had fallen into a quagmire. The situation was really a difficult situation, both at home and abroad. And so his view was, first of all, the main thing is to take advantage of the rivalry between China and Russia, play them off against one another. Now, remember, I said that this rivalry had already emerged by 1961 when Kennedy was the president. And that's what Kennedy should have done. Instead of getting involved, Kennedy and Johnson, instead they were containing China. What they should have done was play these two powers off against one another. But they didn't. No, they went for containment, and it led to this quagmire. So Kissinger's view was, we've got to astutely play the Sino-Soviet rivalry and play one against the other. And in doing so, we can weaken Hanoi, we can weaken the DRV diplomatically. Because we can sort of start playing off these two powers against one another. And the Hanoi, which now has backing for both of these powers, if we play our cards astutely, we can sort of split them and weaken North Vietnam. That was the basic policy. Now, beyond that, and more generally, Kissinger believed in something called the balance of power, which he considered this principle of the balance of power is a fundamental principle, has been, of international relations. It really came into being in the 17th century. It's very old. And a school of political science came into being in the 16th, 17th century called realism, politics of realism, never mind ideology. Politics is all about realism and the interests of the big powers who are jockeying for one another. And the point is that you pursue your interests in terms of this kind of realistic view of your interests as a big power. Now, this view was first sketched out, it's not fully, but sketched out by Niccolo Machiavelli in the 16th century. he was the founder of the school, but there's been a series of great political realists, including Cardinal Richelieu, the Abbé Talleyrand during the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, the Austrian diplomat, the Prince Metternich. And this is the school of realistic politics, great power politics, based on the balance of power. This is what Kissinger is all about. Well, he basically said the key thing is not to upset the international balance of power, because if things sort of completely get out of hand, there'll be some sort of a war. And so we don't want that. We want to maintain the balance of power. In the world, we know that the Chinese are a big power, and so is the Soviet Union, and so are we. We want to maintain this balance of power in international relations. But it's a balance of power within which the United States is the predominant power. The Chinese and the Russians offset American power, but the United States is the dominant power, and we want to maintain that situation. The United States needs to maintain its dominance. So what we need to do is we need to develop a foreign policy which we make certain deals with whoever we can, either the Russians or the Chinese, and gradually we disengage from Vietnam, and at the same time we maintain our preeminence and we maintain our particularly our presence in East Asia. Now this was there's no denying that this was so much more intelligent than what Kennedy and Johnson had been up to. This became at the same time, the Kissinger and Nixon, they believed, yes, American troops need to get out, but we continue the air war. We try to maintain the Republic of Vietnam. We build up the Vietnamese military. We support them with air power. And hopefully out of this overall process of adjustment, the South Vietnamese state can maintain itself. And certainly Nixon and certainly even Kissinger, I would say, basically this was what they were hoping to do. But Kissinger said in his private thoughts, he said, even if South Vietnam falls, America, out of all this, will maintain its position as a great power and even maintain its influence in East Asia. That, in short, was the new politics of Nixon and Kissinger. And as I said, there's a certain elegance and intelligence to this policy. This is the setup. Meanwhile, the American people were, of course, beside themselves, wanted the American war, the American involvement on the ground, the casualties stop. America should get out of the ground war. At the same time, the American public opinion said, we need to, of course, continue to stop communist expansionism. But South Vietnam should defend itself. We can't win the war for the South Vietnamese. And so Nixon understood from the beginning that he would have to get out, he would have to withdraw the ground forces in Vietnam while maintaining and building up support for the Republic of South Vietnam. And it was important to do that to maintain American prestige. I'm giving you Nixon's view, because otherwise, if the Americans withdrew overnight, America's reputation, this would be dishonorable, and Americans' prestige would suffer. And so Nixon fought for years to sort of maintain these policies. He fought for years and years because really it was the Americans only finally got out in 1973, 5 years, because Nixon was determined to hold on and maintain support for the Republic of Vietnam. The first thing he did in order to try to shore up the situation in Vietnam was to bomb Cambodia, the neighboring state of Cambodia. Johnson had Cambodia, the neighboring state. There were tens and tens of thousands of National Liberation troops and North Vietnamese troops who were in sanctuary in Cambodia, close to the border. The Americans were not intruding themselves, except by accident. The ruler of Cambodia, Sihanouk, his name is, and he was a prince, Prince Sihanouk. I'll have more to say about him. He turned a blind eye to the activities of the communists in Vietnam. He was helpless to stop them, and so they basically operated out of jungle sanctuaries. They would move across the border from Cambodia into Vietnam and attack Arvin and attack the United States. So Nixon orders basically bombing of the sanctuaries of the North Vietnamese and the NLF in eastern Cambodia. And so it was in March of 1969 that this bombing began. On the 18th of March, 1968, secret bombing of Cambodia. And the bombing was called Operation Menu. Operation Menu. Menu consisted of breakfast followed by lunch, snack, dinner, and dessert. In other words, the gigantic B-52 bombers were feeding Cambodia they were feeding a menu of bombs: breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, and dessert every day. And ultimately, over 1 million people perished, Cambodians, in this American bombing that began in 1968. And also, Nixon said that the Green Berets should conduct raids into Cambodia. And ultimately, all this was going to destabilize Sihanouk, who's massive. Prince Sihanouk would be overthrown. We'll discuss this. But of course, what the communist troops did was they simply moved deeper into Cambodia. They just moved deeper into the jungle. The bombing did no good whatsoever. And indeed, the question was, if the Americans kept getting more and more involved, they were already sending some ground troops in there, would they become involved in Cambodia? So the Americans would, instead of getting out of the quagmire, as Nixon promised, and the American public wanted, he was getting more deeply involved. So Nixon was afraid that the public would learn of this, and they would basically turn their faces away from Nixon. Nevertheless, in July 1971, the New York Times front page story, he published an account of what Nixon was doing in Cambodia. There were protests, and the public was outraged and so on, always getting more deeply involved. At the same time, almost simultaneous to this, was the same paper, the New York Times, published the Pentagon Papers, which was a secret history of the war. And I'm coming to an end, which was written by, at the orders of Robert McNamara, the former defense secretary, he ordered, at a certain point, he said, how the hell did we get into this situation in the first place? And nobody could explain it. So he had his intellectuals, his military intellectuals, basically write a multi-volume history of the war. You can find it in the Defoe Library or in the downtown public library. Well, in July, one of the intellectuals who wrote this up, by the name of Daniel Ellsberg, he went into the Pentagon, he Xeroxed the whole Pentagon papers, and he gave it to the New York Times. They published it. Of course, Nixon was outraged and launched an inquiry, which was going to turn into he constituted a spy group, which began to investigate people in Washington. And this became the Watergate scandal, which ultimately was going to destroy Richard Nixon. We'll see this hopefully on Wednesday.